Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The small town of Blackwater was a place that didn't often make it onto maps. It was the kind of town that people didn't remember well after leaving. It felt like something you could almost forget, like a dream fading in the morning light. But for those who lived there, Blackwater was everything. A place of secrets, whispers, and things best left hidden. At the edge of town, tucked away behind a thicket of trees, stood an old chapel. The kind of building that seemed to have been there longer than anyone could remember. Its stone walls were weathered, the windows cracked and dark, and the doors hung loosely on their hinges. But despite its age, the chapel had one feature that never faded, the black veil. No one knew exactly when it began, but every midnight, without fail, a group of people would appear in the chapel. Dressed entirely in black, their faces hidden by black veils, they would enter quietly, their steps echoing through the empty streets. No one in town spoke of the group. They were a mystery, a shadow that drifted through Blackwater like a fog that never fully lifted. The townspeople kept their distance, afraid to ask questions. Those who dared to inquire about the group would find themselves met with silence, and their questions would hang in the air, unanswered. The Black Veil Society, as some whispered, held power over the town in ways that few understood. Jack Carter had never believed in secrets. A journalist from the city, Jack had come to Blackwater in search of a story. He didn't believe in rumors or tales of the supernatural. His job was simple: find the truth, no matter how dark it was. So when he heard the stories about the Black Veil Society, he decided to investigate. He had heard them all, the whispers in the cafes, the nervous looks from the shopkeepers, the strange absence of people in the streets late at night. But it was the most bizarre part of the story that caught his attention: the sacrifices. The townspeople claimed that the Black Veil Society made pacts with something dark, something ancient. And every year, on the night of the summer solstice, someone would disappear, never to be seen again. Jack wasn't afraid. Not really. He had covered cults and conspiracies before. He'd even been to places far more dangerous than Blackwater. But there was something about the town that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't fear. It was more like an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. Something watched from the shadows, waiting. He decided to stay in Blackwater for a week, hoping to gather enough information for a piece that would get him noticed. He rented a small room at the inn, a place that was as tired as the town itself. The landlord was an old man with a permanent scowl, who didn't seem to like outsiders. Jack smiled politely and asked about the Black Veil Society. The old man's face went pale and his lips tightened. Without a word, he turned and walked away. That night, Jack sat in his room, scribbling notes in his notebook. He knew the stories had to be exaggerated. There were no demons or ancient pacts, just people with strange habits. But something gnawed at him. The more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that the Black Veil Society wasn't just a group of eccentrics. They were hiding something. Something important. It was after midnight when Jack decided to act. He had spent the entire evening watching the chapel from the window of his room. At first, he had only seen a few veiled figures slip into the building. But tonight, the chapel seemed alive. More people were gathering than he had seen before. Their black cloaks billowed as they moved silently through the streets, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog that had rolled in. Jack grabbed his camera, slipped on his jacket, and stepped out into the cold. He moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't stop. The chapel was only a few blocks away, hidden behind a dense row of trees. He could feel the chill of the night air against his skin. But the closer he got, the more the town seemed to fade into the background. It was as if the chapel was pulling him in, like something was calling to him. When Jack reached the chapel, he crouched low behind a large stone pillar, his breath fogging in the air. He could see the figures entering one by one, their black veils hiding their identities. There was no sound, just the soft rustling of their cloaks as they filed into the building. Jack's fingers trembled as he adjusted his camera, capturing every moment. His eyes scanned the group, searching for any clues, but all he saw was the procession, silent, orderly, and unnerving. He waited and waited until, finally, the last figure entered the chapel. The door creaked closed behind them, and the town fell silent once more. Jack's mind raced. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had to get inside. With a final glance around to make sure no one was watching, Jack crept up to the chapel's entrance. The door was ajar, just slightly, enough for him to slip through unnoticed. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a low groan. Inside, the chapel was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of candles placed in strange patterns along the stone floor. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the low murmur of voices filled the space. Jack moved deeper into the chapel, careful not to make a sound. He stayed close to the walls, hiding in the shadows. The figures in the black veils were gathered in a circle around an altar at the center of the room. Their voices were soft but intense, chanting something that Jack couldn't understand. As he moved closer, he could feel the heat of the candles on his skin, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each step. Suddenly, one of the veiled figures turned. Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. He held his breath, praying that he hadn't been seen. The figure paused, looking directly at him. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, and then the figure slowly turned away, returning to the circle. Jack let out a quiet sigh of relief. He had to stay focused. The ritual had begun. The air inside the chapel grew colder as Jack moved further into the room, careful to keep his footsteps as quiet as possible. The chants grew louder, more rhythmic, and with each passing second, Jack felt a strange pull in his chest. It was as if the very room itself was alive, and something deep within it was aware of his presence. His eyes darted from one veiled figure to another, each of them standing motionless, their heads bowed, their hands raised to the sky as though in silent communion with an unseen force. At the center of the circle, the altar stood tall, a large black stone slab, covered in strange symbols and markings. It was old, ancient, in fact, and Jack could feel an unsettling energy radiating from it. He had seen these kinds of symbols before in his research on cults, but none of them made any sense. The shapes twisted and curved in impossible ways, their meanings lost to time. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't just some odd religious gathering. This was something darker, something much more dangerous. Jack crept closer to the altar, his breath catching in his throat as he heard a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was low, guttural, and filled with an unnatural power. "We offer the blood," the voice whispered, almost like a hiss. "We offer the soul." Jack froze in place, his mind racing. Blood? Soul? What the hell were they talking about? He reached for his camera, hoping to capture the moment, but his hand trembled so violently that he could barely hold it steady. Through the lens, he could see one of the veiled figures step forward, raising a dagger high into the air. The blade gleamed in the candlelight, and Jack's stomach turned as he saw something that made his heart stop. A figure bound to the altar. It was a woman. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face pale, and she was trembling violently, her body strapped to the cold stone. The veiled figures didn't seem to notice her struggle. They were too focused on the ritual, too absorbed in their chant. But Jack couldn't take his eyes off her. She was shaking uncontrollably, her lips moving, mouthing something that seemed like a silent scream. Her eyes met Jack's, and for a brief moment, it felt as though she was looking right at him, pleading for help. The figure with the dagger brought it down in a swift motion. Jack's stomach lurched as the woman's scream pierced the air, a blood-curdling wail that echoed through the chapel. Time seemed to slow as the blade sliced into her skin, and Jack had to fight the overwhelming urge to run. But he couldn't. Not yet. He had to know what was happening. He had to understand. The veiled figures moved in closer, their hands reaching for the woman's body, their faces hidden but their movements unmistakable. They were performing some kind of twisted ritual, drawing the woman's blood into a small chalice. Jack could feel the room itself darken, the atmosphere growing thick with something malevolent. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of this twisted ceremony, whether he liked it or not. As the figures finished, they stepped back and raised their hands, their chants growing louder, more frantic. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine as the temperature in the chapel dropped, his breath visible in the frigid air. And then, in the middle of the room, something shifted. A shadow, darker than the darkest night, began to swirl in the center of the altar. It was slow at first, like smoke rising from a fire, but as the chanting grew, so did the shadow. It took form, bending and twisting into a shape that made Jack's blood run cold. At first, it looked like a figure, humanoid but grotesque, with elongated limbs and twisted features. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was an abyss, a hollow, black void that seemed to draw in everything around it. Jack stumbled back, his heart pounding so loud that he feared the figures would hear it. He knew he should run, but he was frozen, his legs refusing to move. The shadow continued to grow, its presence overwhelming the entire chapel. The air seemed to hum with power, as if the very foundations of the building were shaking. The veiled figures raised their hands in reverence, bowing before the entity that was now standing before them. One of the figures stepped forward, removing their veil. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the person's face was revealed. A man, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his lips parted to reveal sharp, yellowed teeth. "The pact is sealed," the man said, his voice low and rasping. "The blood has been given. The soul is ours." The entity's dark form seemed to writhe, its tendrils reaching out and twisting through the air like serpents. Jack could feel the pressure in the room growing, as though the very walls were closing in around him. It was too much, he had to get out, but his body wouldn't obey. His feet were glued to the floor, his mind caught in the grip of whatever dark force was at work. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow began to fade. The chanting ceased, and the figures lowered their hands. The man with the twisted grin looked directly at Jack, his eyes locking onto him with an unsettling intensity. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. "But now that you have, you'll see the price of curiosity." Before Jack could react, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The rest of the veiled figures followed suit, leaving the chapel in eerie silence. Jack stood frozen in place, the image of the dark entity burned into his mind. His hands were shaking, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had to leave. He had to get out of there. But as he turned to head for the door, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The woman, the one who had been sacrificed, was no longer on the altar. Her body was gone. The only thing left behind was a pool of dark blood, slowly seeping into the cracks of the stone floor. Jack ran. Jack bolted toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest as he stumbled over the uneven stone floor. He could still hear the low hum of something malevolent reverberating in the air, like the chapel itself was alive with dread. His hands fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him, and for a moment he felt completely trapped. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get out. He had to leave before whatever dark presence in that room reached out and grabbed him. His mind raced back to the chapel's entrance. He had seen the door slightly ajar when he'd first snuck inside. There was no time to waste. Jack turned away from the stubborn door and darted toward the side of the room. His eyes scanned the walls, searching for another exit, but there was nothing. Just dark, oppressive stone. The shadow that had taken form in the center of the room still lingered in his mind, the memory of its twisting limbs and void-like face gnawing at his sanity. Then suddenly he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind him. They were slow, deliberate, almost as if the person was savoring his fear. Jack spun around, his eyes wide, but there was no one there. The air seemed to press down on him, and the oppressive feeling grew even stronger. The darkness in the chapel felt as though it was moving, shifting, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to cooperate. He felt as if something was watching him, something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He backed away, step by step, his mind racing for a way out. And then, like a cruel twist of fate, the lights, if they could even be called that, flickered, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. In the darkness, Jack could barely make out the shape of something in the far corner, near the altar. His stomach turned as he saw the woman again. Only this time, she was standing, her back to him. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in long, wet strands around her face. She was still wearing the bloodstains from the ritual, but now, her movements were unnaturally jerky, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Her head turned slowly toward him, and Jack felt a wave of terror crash over him. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets where once there had been life. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The room seemed to spin as the woman's body twisted unnaturally, her neck cracking with a sickening snap. "Run," she whispered, her voice a hollow, breathless rasp. It was enough to snap Jack out of his stupor. His instincts screamed at him to flee, and this time his legs obeyed. He turned and ran for the door, slamming his shoulder into it with all his strength. The door didn't give. He pounded on it again, his heart racing, panic flooding his veins. Then, with a loud creak, the door swung open. Jack tumbled forward into the night, his breath catching in his throat as the cool air filled his lungs. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. His mind was consumed with images of the chapel, the woman, the shadow, things he didn't fully understand, but knew deep in his gut were not of this world. As Jack ran through the streets of Blackwater, he felt the oppressive weight of the town press down on him. It was as if the buildings themselves were closing in, their windows dark and silent, watching him as he passed. He had to get out. He had to leave before whatever dark force had a hold of this place could catch up with him. But just as Jack reached the edge of the town, something stopped him cold. A figure emerged from the fog ahead of him, its silhouette barely visible in the low light. Jack froze, his blood running cold as he recognized the shape of the veiled figure from the chapel. "You cannot leave," the figure said, its voice a deep, resonating tone that seemed to vibrate through his bones. "You have seen too much." Jack took a step back, his heart pounding in his ears. The figure took a slow step toward him, its presence heavy and suffocating. Jack could feel the air around him grow thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching toward him like claws. He felt his throat tighten, his mouth dry, as if the town itself was trying to swallow him whole. "Why are you doing this?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. His words were lost in the night air, as if the town itself was deaf to his cries. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it lifted its hands slowly, revealing the black veils that covered its face. Beneath the veil, Jack could see a pair of dark, empty eyes staring back at him, eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. And then, just as quickly as the figure had appeared, it vanished into the fog, leaving Jack standing alone in the cold night air. Jack stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The events in the chapel, the shadow, the woman, everything was a blur in his mind, a twisted nightmare that he couldn't shake. But one thing was clear, he wasn't safe. Not in Blackwater. Not anywhere. He needed to leave. He had to. But when Jack turned to run again, he stopped dead in his tracks. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, he saw more figures. more veiled shapes, standing in a perfect line, blocking his path. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching him, waiting. Jack's chest tightened as he realized there was no way out. The town had already claimed him. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. The figures in the fog stood perfectly still, like statues, but Jack could feel the weight of their gaze on him, each one scrutinizing him from beneath their veils. His legs trembled, and he tried to take a step back, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The fog thickened, swirling around him, drowning out any sound except the pounding of his own heartbeat. He was trapped. Every direction he turned, there they were, more of them, emerging from the mist like ghosts. Their silent, lifeless forms moved toward him, and Jack could feel his breath catch in his throat. What do you want from me?" Jack stammered, his voice trembling. There was no reply. The figures simply moved closer, one step at a time, their presence suffocating. He tried to turn and run again, but something inside him, some force, kept him rooted in place. It was as though the very air around him was alive, pressing down on him, making every movement feel like it was weighed down by 100 invisible hands. Suddenly, a figure stepped forward. It was the same man he had seen earlier in the chapel, the one with the twisted grin. His pale, ghostly face was still twisted in that unnerving smile, his eyes wide and empty of any humanity. "You should have stayed away, outsider," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too calm for the situation. "Now, you are part of our society. There is no escape for you. Not anymore." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He felt as if his throat had closed up, his body paralyzed by the man's chilling presence. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but his body betrayed him. "You've seen the pact," the man continued, his smile widening. "You've witnessed what we do, what we offer. And now, you will become a part of it. Your curiosity, it has a price." The figures around Jack began to circle him, their slow, deliberate movements closing in from all sides. He could see their hands now, long and bony, their fingers twitching in the dim light. He could hear the soft rustle of fabric as they moved closer, their veils brushing against their bodies. A sickening realization spread through Jack's chest. He was surrounded. There was nowhere to go, no escape. The figures didn't speak, but their presence spoke volumes. It was a presence that filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something ancient, something vile, had awakened in the depths of this cursed town. Suddenly, the man with the twisted grin reached out, placing his cold, skeletal hand on Jack's shoulder. Jack recoiled at the touch, but the grip was firm, unyielding. "We don't take kindly to those who interfere," the man whispered. "You'll see what happens when you break the rules. You'll witness the price of your meddling." Jack's legs finally obeyed, and he stumbled backward, trying to break free from the man's grip. His eyes darted around the figures closing in on him, but there was nowhere to run. His chest tightened, and his vision blurred. "Please," Jack begged, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The man chuckled softly, a low, eerie sound that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "Of course you didn't know, but now you do, and you'll understand what it means to be bound by the black veil." Before Jack could react, he felt a sharp pain shoot through his chest, as though something had pierced him from the inside. He gasped for air, his hands clutching at his shirt, but there was nothing there. Nothing he could see. The pain intensified, radiating through his entire body, and his knees buckled beneath him. The man's voice came again, distant but clear, as if it were echoing from the deepest pit of his mind. "The pact is not just for us. It is for all who walk this land, all who seek what they should not. You are a part of it now. Your soul belongs to the veil." Jack's head spun as the world around him began to distort. The fog thickened, and he could feel the very ground beneath his feet shifting, warping, twisting. His vision darkened, and his legs gave out completely, sending him to his knees. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the twisted grin of the man, his eyes gleaming with something dark and ancient. When Jack awoke, he wasn't sure where he was. His head throbbed, and his body felt heavy, as though he had been sleeping for far too long. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his foggy vision, but when he looked around, all he saw was blackness. No light, no stars, no moon, just an endless void that stretched in every direction. He tried to move, but his limbs felt stiff, unresponsive, like they didn't belong to him. Panic gripped his chest as he struggled to sit up, but his movements were sluggish, as if he were fighting against something unseen. Then slowly he began to hear it, the sound of whispers. At first they were faint, almost inaudible, but as he strained to listen, they grew louder, more distinct. The voices were all around him, echoing in the darkness. Some were low and guttural, others were high-pitched, almost childlike. But all of them carried the same eerie, unsettling tone. "Jack!" One voice called softly. He froze. That was his name. "Jack, you're here with us now," another voice whispered, this one closer. It sounded like the man with the twisted grin. "You've seen the truth. You've witnessed the pact. Now you'll live it." Jack's pulse raced. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. "Welcome to the Vale," the voice murmured, as the darkness seemed to press in around him. The very air felt thick with something ancient, something insidious. Jack realized, in that moment, that he was no longer in the world he had known. The black veil had claimed him. Jack's heart thundered in his chest as the whispers continued to swirl around him, their voices indistinct but constant, like a swarm of unseen insects. The air around him was heavy, suffocating, thick with a presence he couldn't quite grasp. He tried to move again, but his limbs felt as though they were encased in stone, unyielding, unresponsive. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, there was a sudden shift in the air, a sharp, almost electric tension that made his skin crawl. The darkness that had surrounded him began to dissolve, though not in the way he expected. The void didn't fade into light. Instead, the shadows themselves seemed to stretch and twist, warping into grotesque shapes. Figures emerged from the gloom, rising from the very ground beneath him like phantoms rising from a grave. He couldn't see their faces clearly, but he could feel their eyes on him. Hundreds of eyes, all staring, watching, judging. His breath caught in his throat as a tall figure stepped forward, its silhouette casting a long, unnerving shadow that seemed to stretch out toward him like a claw. The figure spoke, its voice low and gravelly. "You are here now, Jack. You belong to the Vale." Jack's eyes flicked from one figure to another, his mind racing. They were all wearing the same black veils, but their bodies were different, twisted, inhuman, as if something unnatural had reshaped them. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were savoring his fear. One of the figures, shorter and hunched, stepped closer, its hand reaching out toward him. "It's time," it whispered, and Jack felt a shudder run through his body. The hand was icy cold, its touch making his skin crawl. "It's time to take your place." Jack tried to step back, to move, to break free from the grip of whatever nightmare he had fallen into. But his legs refused to obey. His heart pounded louder in his ears as he looked around wildly for any sign of escape. But there was none. Why me?" Jack finally managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper against the overwhelming silence. I don't belong here." The figure with the twisted grin appeared again, standing just behind the others. His pale face glinted in the dim light, his eyes filled with that same malevolent gleam. "You never belonged here, Jack. That's why you're here now. You sought something you shouldn't have. You wanted to know the truth, to uncover the mystery. And now," he let out a low, satisfied chuckle, "now you will serve the Vale. You will be our vessel." Jack's eyes widened in horror as the words sank in. A vessel? What did that mean? What were they planning to do to him? His chest tightened with terror. and he struggled against the invisible force that held him in place. He tried to scream, but no sound came. He could feel the pressure building inside his chest, his lungs fighting for air, but the suffocating weight of the veil's power crushed him, leaving him gasping for breath. "Don't struggle," the figure with the twisted grin whispered. "There's no escape. You're already one of us." The others moved closer now, their figures shifting in the darkness like shadows coalescing into something far more sinister. The hunched figure reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against Jack's face. "Shoo," it murmured. "It's time." And then everything went black. Jack's next awakening was nothing like the first. There was no black void, no cold, suffocating air, no shadows stretching toward him. Instead, there was a soft, damp chill around him. The scent of earth and decay filled his nose, and he could hear the sound of distant, rushing water. For a moment, he thought he had escaped, that maybe the horrors he'd witnessed had all been a nightmare, a fevered dream his mind had conjured up in the darkness. But as his vision slowly adjusted to the dim light, he realized the truth. He was lying on the cold, hard ground of a small, cramped room. The walls were made of rough stone, damp with moisture. The air was thick with mildew, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the space. His limbs were still stiff, as if he had been asleep for far too long, but he could feel the weight of his body against the ground. Jack tried to sit up, but as he did, something cold and metallic clinked around his wrists. He looked down to see thick iron chains wrapped around his arms and legs, anchoring him to the ground. Panic surged through him as he tugged at the chains, but they held firm. His heart raced in his chest, and his mind spiraled. No, this couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. Not again. The door to the small, stone chamber creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was the figure with the twisted grin, his face cold and expressionless, his eyes gleaming with that same predatory hunger. "You're awake," the man said simply, his voice low and steady. "Good." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy. He could barely force a whisper past his lips. What is this? Where am I?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked closer, circling Jack like a predator assessing its prey. "This is your new home, Jack. This is where you will remain, until the veil has what it wants." Jack's eyes widened in horror. What do you want from me?" The man knelt down in front of him, his face inches from Jack's. "You," he said quietly. "You are the sacrifice. You are the vessel that will carry the pack's power." Jack's mind reeled. No, I can't be. I don't understand. What are you talking about?" The man leaned in closer, his voice soft and menacing. "You were chosen because of your curiosity. You sought the truth. You uncovered the veil's secret, and now the veil will claim its price." He reached out, brushing a cold hand against Jack's cheek. "You will become the new vessel. The pact demands it." Jack's stomach churned with fear, his blood running cold. The chains around his wrists felt heavier now, as if they were tightening, constricting around him. The weight of the situation settled on him like a suffocating blanket. He tried to push the man away, but his body felt weak, and the chains made movement impossible. Desperation surged through him, and he shouted, "Please, let me go. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The man's grin widened. "You knew enough. Now there's no going back. You are ours." And as the man's chilling laughter echoed in the chamber, Jack realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. Not now. Not ever. Jack's mind swirled with terror, his thoughts scattered as the man's laughter faded into the walls of the stone chamber. The realization of what was happening, what he had gotten himself into, hit him like a physical blow. The chains were tight, their cold, rough metal biting into his skin as he strained against them, trying to free himself, to run, to do anything. But there was nothing, no escape. He was trapped. The man with the twisted grin stood over him, his figure looming in the dim light of the chamber. His pale eyes gleamed with a sickening satisfaction, as though he were savoring every moment of Jack's struggle. "Do you understand now?" the man said, his voice calm, almost patronizing. "You thought you could just walk into our world, uncover our secret, and leave. But no one leaves the veil. Not once you've seen the truth." Jack's throat tightened as he fought for air. Why me?" His voice cracked with desperation. "What do you want with me? I'm just a nobody. I'm not special." The man crouched down, his face inches from Jack's. The grin on his lips never faltered. "You're special, Jack. You're the perfect candidate. You have the spirit of curiosity, the desire to uncover what should remain hidden. And that makes you ideal for the pact." Jack's stomach turned. His heart hammered in his chest as the meaning of those words began to sink in. "What pact? What are you talking about?" he gasped, trying to shake off the dread that had settled like a weight in his chest. The man's eyes flickered with something like amusement, and he leaned in closer. "You saw the ritual, didn't you? The sacrifices, the offerings to the demon. We've been carrying out the pact for generations. We offer our souls, our bodies, as payment for power, for control. And now, Jack," he paused, letting the words hang in the air like a suffocating cloud. "Now we're offering you. You'll be the one to carry our debt." Jack felt as though the ground was slipping out from beneath him. His breath came in sharp gasps as he fought to understand what the man was saying. Sacrifices? A demon? The pact? It all sounded like something out of a nightmare, but the cold stone walls around him, the iron chains, and the eerie silence of the chamber made it all too real. His thoughts raced in panic. No, I don't want this. I didn't ask for this," he shouted, his voice cracking with the intensity of his fear. The man's expression shifted, his grin fading into something colder, something more unsettling. He reached out and placed a hand on Jack's forehead, his fingers icy and firm. "You don't get to choose, Jack. The veil chooses, and it has chosen you." Jack recoiled, but the grip on his head tightened. His vision blurred as a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. His body swayed, and he felt as though he were losing his grip on reality, as if something was pulling him down into an abyss. The chamber around him began to shift, its walls stretching and contracting as though they were breathing. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, as if something ancient, something immense, was drawing closer, awakening. His mind screamed in horror as he tried to break free, but the chains only tightened, biting into his wrists and ankles. He could feel the cold, slick metal pressing against his skin, as if the chains themselves were feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each passing second. And then he felt it, a presence. It wasn't just the man. It wasn't just the veil. It was something far darker, far more powerful. Something that made the very air feel as though it were charged with energy, an energy that was both ancient and evil. Jack's breath caught in his throat as a shadow began to form in the corner of the room. It started as a dark smudge, a silhouette, and then slowly it began to take shape. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and twisted. Its features were indistinct, a mass of shifting darkness, but its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread, a weight that crushed Jack's chest. He felt his heart beat faster, each thump a painful echo in his mind. His head spun, and he could barely focus on the figure as it loomed closer. He wanted to look away, to close his eyes and pretend it wasn't there, but something, some force, kept him frozen, his gaze fixed on the shadow. The figure's shape became clearer, more defined, and Jack could make out the faintest outline of a face, pale and gaunt, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. The eyes seemed to pierce into him, searching his soul, laying bare all his secrets, all his fears. It spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. "Jack," it whispered, its voice laced with malice, "you are the one who will carry our debt. You are the one who will serve the veil." The ground beneath Jack's feet seemed to tremble. as if the earth itself were shaking in response to the creature's words. His skin crawled, every instinct in his body screaming for him to flee, to escape, but he couldn't. The chains held him fast, the demon's gaze kept him in place, and his own body refused to move. "Please," Jack whispered, his voice weak and pleading. "I didn't mean to. I never wanted this." The creature's eyes narrowed, and a low, menacing chuckle rumbled from its chest. "It doesn't matter what you wanted, Jack. It's too late for regrets. You belong to the Veil now. Your soul is ours." Jack's chest tightened as the figure reached out, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against his face. The touch was cold, like ice, and he felt it seep into his skin, into his very bones. The world around him began to distort again, the edges of his vision blurring as the creature's presence overwhelmed him. He could feel it now, the weight of the pact, the price he had to pay. It was not just his body that had been claimed. It was his soul, his very essence, bound to the Veil, to the demon that had made the pact so many years ago. The figure loomed closer, its face a mask of ancient evil. "You are our vessel now, Jack, and you will carry the burden of our pact, just as we all do. You will serve forever." Jack's eyes widened in terror as the darkness closed in around him, the creature's presence suffocating him, choking the last remnants of hope from his mind. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the cold hands of the Veil wrapping around him, pulling him into its grip, dragging him into the depths of its twisted world. And as the last vestiges of light vanished from his vision, all Jack could hear was the echoing sound of the creature's voice, whispering in his ear, promising an eternity of torment. "You belong to us now." Jack's senses dulled as the creature's grip tightened, its cold fingers pressing against his face like a vice. The oppressive air grew heavier, colder. His body seemed to grow weaker by the second, as though the darkness around him was feeding on his very life force. He could feel the icy tendrils of despair wrapping around his soul, drawing him deeper into the abyss. His mind screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to go. His vision blurred, and the shadows began to swallow him whole, pulling him into a place where time didn't exist, where reality twisted and bent like a fevered dream. Then, a voice broke through the suffocating silence. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct, until Jack could hear it clearly. "He's not ready." Jack's eyes snapped open. His heart leapt in his chest as the chains around his wrists and ankles suddenly loosened. He gasped, confused, disoriented. The oppressive presence of the demon and its dark influence receded, the cold fingers retreating as if pushed back by an unseen force. The shadowy figure that had loomed over him now faltered, its shape flickering, unstable. Something had changed, something had interrupted the pact. The room, too, seemed to shift, its walls flickering like an illusion, bending and warping. A second figure emerged from the darkness, one that was far less monstrous, more human in shape. This new figure was cloaked in a long, flowing robe, the edges trailing along the ground like the shadows themselves. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but its voice rang out clear and commanding. "The boy has not yet fulfilled his role." The demon's glowing eyes narrowed as it turned its attention to the newcomer. Its form trembled, as if weakened by this interruption. "He is ours," the demon hissed, its voice like 1,000 scraping nails. "The pact is made." The cloaked figure stepped forward, and Jack could feel its presence, strong but not as suffocating as the demon's. There was a strange calmness about it, an unearthly stillness that made the air itself feel quieter. Its voice held an authority that made the shadows themselves hesitate. "The pact requires a final sacrifice," the cloaked figure spoke slowly, deliberately. "But that sacrifice must come willingly." The demon roared in defiance, its monstrous shape swelling as it tried to regain its dominance. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Jack could see his breath clouding in the frigid air. "He will not choose. He is weak. The Veil's debt demands it. He will serve." The cloaked figure did not flinch. Instead, it raised one hand slowly, palm outstretched, and the air shifted, the very atmosphere crackling with energy. The chains around Jack's wrists and ankles shattered like brittle glass, falling away to the ground with a metallic clatter. Jack, still dazed and trembling, struggled to sit up. His chest ached from the pressure of the demon's presence, but now, with the chains gone, there was a brief moment of freedom. His eyes flickered to the cloaked figure, the only being in the room who seemed to offer even the slightest hope. The boy will decide his fate. The cloaked figure's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, as if every word carried weight far beyond the mortal realm. The demon hissed again, its eyes glowing bright with fury. "You dare oppose me?" The cloaked figure did not respond to the demon's threat. Instead, it turned its attention to Jack. "What will it be, boy?" the voice asked, soft but insistent. "Will you take the burden as the veil demands? Will you serve in exchange for power?" Jack's mind spun, every part of him screaming to escape, to run far from whatever dark fate awaited him. But the image of the demon, its shadowy form and cold eyes, still burned in his mind. He could feel its grip tightening, its influence clawing at his thoughts. "No," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse and raw. He clenched his fists, desperate to regain control, to push the terror away. The cloaked figure nodded slightly. "You still have a choice." Jack's body shook with the weight of those words. How could he have a choice? The veil had already claimed him. The pact had already been made. But somehow, in the presence of this stranger, this figure who exuded an almost calming force, Jack felt a tiny flicker of hope. The demon snarled, its form swelling as if to consume them both. "You are a fool," it spat. "He belongs to me. You cannot take him from me." The cloaked figure raised its hand again, and the demon recoiled, as though struck by an invisible force. Its form flickered and warped, its shape dissolving like mist in the wind. For a brief moment, the room was still, utterly silent. Then the cloaked figure turned its full attention back to Jack. "Your decision, Jack," it urged gently. "Will you take the burden of the veil, or will you choose another path?" The room around them flickered again, as though reality itself were straining under the weight of the choices being made. Jack's mind raced, every thought jumbled with fear, confusion, and desperation. Was there really another path? Could he even escape this nightmare? Could he really defy the veil and the pact that bound him? But then, as the cloaked figure's eyes met his, Jack felt something shift within him. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A sense of clarity, of purpose. The shadow that had loomed over him for so long, the shadow of the demon, the veil, suddenly seemed smaller, less terrifying. The demon howled in fury, but Jack no longer felt the cold weight of its presence pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I choose," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear still churning in his chest. The cloaked figure's gaze softened. "Then choose wisely." Without another word, the figure raised both hands, and the room began to twist and shift once more, the shadows growing deeper, the air thick with ancient energy. Jack's heart raced, but his resolve grew stronger. He was no longer just a pawn in a dark game. He was choosing to fight back, to reclaim what was his. But as the power around him surged, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the true cost of his decision was still far from clear. The path he had chosen was one of great risk, and there was no going back. The dark figure of the demon began to reform, its glowing eyes fixed on Jack once more. "You will regret this," it growled, its voice full of venom. "You will never escape the veil." But Jack stood firm, ready to face whatever came next, ready to confront the darkness once and for all. The air in the chamber grew even heavier, thick with the palpable tension between Jack and the demon. Every inch of his skin prickled with the knowledge that the decision he had just made was far from simple. His heart hammered in his chest, a steady rhythm that felt as though it might burst out of him at any moment. The demon's rage echoed through the room, a sound that vibrated in the very bones of the earth. Jack could feel its malevolent presence forming around him once again, thickening like fog, seeping into his thoughts, his fears. But even as the demon swelled in size, its body morphing into something more monstrous, more terrifying, Jack stood tall, unwilling to give in to the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. The cloaked figure beside him remained unmoving, a silent sentinel. Jack looked toward it, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do I do now?" The figure's voice was calm, serene even, as if untouched by the storm raging around them. "You face the darkness, Jack. You face the veil. But know this, your choice is not without sacrifice." Jack swallowed hard. The words weighed on him, and he understood that he had just crossed a threshold. There was no going back. He could feel the truth of it in his bones. The price he would have to pay was already coming into focus, though he could not yet see it fully. The demon shrieked, its voice splitting the air like 1,000 blades scraping across stone. It lunged forward, its massive claws reaching for Jack, its eyes burning with fury. "You are mine, mortal," the demon roared, its voice a guttural growl. "You cannot escape the pact. You will serve." The cloaked figure moved with a fluidity that seemed almost unnatural, raising its hands to the ceiling. Jack watched as dark, swirling tendrils of energy began to form, twisting in the air like serpents, but with an intensity, a power, that was far beyond anything he had ever seen. The demon hesitated for a fraction of a second, recoiling from the surge of energy. But its hatred for Jack was far stronger than its fear. "I will break you," it bellowed, and with a sudden violent motion, it lashed out, a mass of shadow and claws. Before Jack could even react, the cloaked figure moved, its hands now raised before it. A wave of energy erupted from its palms, crashing into the demon like a tidal wave. The force of it sent Jack stumbling back, his breath knocked from him as the room seemed to explode with light and sound. The demon screeched in agony as the energy coursed through its form, twisting its body, warping it. For a brief moment, Jack could see it for what it truly was, an ancient, otherworldly entity, its skin crawling with dark symbols, its eyes burning with an eternal rage. The cloaked figure's voice rang out over the chaos. "This is not your victory, demon. This is not your time." The demon howled in defiance, but the energy continued to push against it, forcing it back. Slowly, reluctantly, the demon began to recede, its form collapsing into the shadows, its roar fading into the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Jack's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his pulse still racing. His head spun from the overwhelming rush of power and the sheer terror of what had just happened. But even as the demon's presence began to fade, he could still feel its influence lingering in the corners of his mind, like a shadow that would never fully disappear. The cloaked figure lowered its hands, and the room slowly returned to its previous state, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. Jack stared at the figure, his heart still pounding in his chest. "You did it," Jack whispered, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "You stopped it." The cloaked figure nodded slowly, its form standing tall and unwavering. "For now," it said, its voice low and steady. "But the demon is not gone. It will return as it always does. The veil will call on you again, Jack. You cannot run from it. Not forever." The truth of those words hung heavily in the air, and Jack felt his stomach twist with dread. He had taken a stand, yes, but had it been enough? The veil's grip on him was far from over, and now he had made an enemy of the most dangerous entity he had ever encountered. Jack swallowed, struggling to steady his breath. What happens now? The cloaked figure turned its head slightly, its features hidden beneath the hood. "Now, Jack, you must prepare. The veil is not something that can be outrun. It is a part of you now, and you will need to learn how to face it. You must understand the rules of the pact you almost became a part of." Jack nodded, though his mind was a blur of confusion and fear. "How do I fight it? How do I make it stop?" The cloaked figure took a step closer to him, its gaze seeming to pierce into Jack's very soul. You don't. Not alone. The veil is ancient, older than anything you can comprehend. But there are others like me, others who have stood against it. There is hope, Jack, but only if you're willing to walk the path. The question is, are you? Jack felt the weight of the question press down on him. He had never asked for any of this. His curiosity had led him here, to this dark, twisted place. But now that he had seen the horror of the veil and the demon it served, he couldn't just walk away. He had to fight. He had to find a way to break the hold the veil had on him. I don't know if I can do this, Jack admitted, his voice shaky. The cloaked figure studied him for a moment, then nodded. No one is ever ready, but the first step is always the hardest, and you've already taken it. With that, the figure stepped back, its form beginning to fade into the shadows once more. Before it disappeared completely, it spoke one final time. Remember, Jack, the veil watches. It always watches. And with that, the figure was gone, leaving Jack alone in the chamber once more. The silence that followed was deafening, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still there, just beyond his reach. The veil was watching, and it wasn't done with him yet. Jack's resolve hardened. He would face it. He had to. There was no turning back now. But as he turned to leave the chamber, the last thing he saw was the faintest flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. A shadow, too large to be anything human, crawling across the floor like a living nightmare. And Jack knew deep down that his fight against the veil was only just beginning. The night felt endless. As Jack stumbled out of the chamber, the door slamming shut behind him with a heavy thud, he felt the oppressive weight of the veil still clinging to his every breath. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, yet there was one undeniable truth that burned through it all. He had made a choice that had bound him to something ancient and terrible, and now there was no escape. The air outside the chamber was cold and still, the shadows long and stretching across the town like they were alive. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around, half expecting to see the cloaked figure appear again, or worse, the demon, its glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness. But all he saw was the quiet, empty street, the faint echo of his footsteps the only sound in the night. "It's not over," Jack whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the wind. The veil was still out there, waiting for him, watching him. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, like a cold presence creeping over his skin. It wasn't done with him. Not yet. As he walked down the narrow path that led to his home, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He quickened his pace, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. The streets were empty, too empty. His footsteps seemed to echo louder, stretching into the silence, until it felt as though the town itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, there was a sound, a low, almost imperceptible scraping from behind him. Jack froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But the street was empty, not a soul in sight. With a shaky breath, Jack continued walking, faster now, trying to ignore the growing panic in his chest. The scraping sound continued, though this time closer, like something dragging its feet along the ground. Jack's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to keep moving, until the sound stopped abruptly. He turned again, and this time he saw it. A figure, cloaked in black, standing at the end of the street, motionless. The veil. It had found him. The demon's presence was thick in the air, suffocating, and Jack could feel its power rolling off of the figure like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The faint sound of whispers began, too soft to understand, but it sent a chill down his spine. Jack's legs trembled, his breath shallow, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. The veil's grip was tightening again, and this time there was nowhere to run. "Jack!" a voice whispered from the darkness. It was the cloaked figure, but it wasn't the same figure he had seen earlier. This one's voice was low, rough, its tone an unmistakable warning. Jack took a step back, but the figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. The whispers grew louder, turning into words, but they were still distorted, as though coming from far away. "You cannot escape," the voice intoned. "The pact was made. You belong to the Veil now. Forever." Jack's blood ran cold, but he clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand his ground. He wasn't going to let it control him. Not again. "I'm not yours," Jack said, his voice shaking but strong. "I'll find a way to break this. I won't give in." The figure didn't respond immediately. It simply watched him, its eyes hidden beneath the shadow of the hood. For a moment, there was a sense of stillness, of something waiting. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure raised one hand, and Jack felt the world around him shift. The ground trembled, and the air grew thick again, the dark power of the Veil surging through the streets like a wave. The whispers became clearer, more insistent, until they filled his mind completely. "You cannot fight what is already inside you." The words echoed in his head, reverberating like 1,000 voices, and Jack stumbled back, overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught. The shadows seemed to close in around him, and for a moment he felt himself being drawn into them, as though they were pulling him down into the earth itself. But then something unexpected happened. A flash of light. It was so bright, so sudden, that it blinded Jack for a moment. The shadows that had been creeping toward him recoiled, like they had been burned by the light. Jack's vision cleared, and before him stood the cloaked figure from before, the one who had helped him in the chamber. It stepped forward, its hands raised in a protective gesture. The Veil recoiled, as if repelled by the very presence of this figure. The demon's dark form shrieked in anger, but the light only intensified, forcing it to retreat. "The Veil cannot hold him," the figure said, its voice calm but firm. "He is not yet lost, not yet consumed." The darkness wavered, and for the briefest of moments, Jack felt hope. "What is this?" Jack gasped, his voice hoarse. "What's happening?" "You have a choice, Jack," the figure replied, its voice warm, yet still filled with authority. "You can break the pact. You can choose to fight the Veil or embrace it. But know this, embracing it will destroy you. It will consume everything you are. Fighting it will not be easy, and it will cost you more than you can imagine." Jack's mind raced, the weight of the decision crashing over him. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. He couldn't allow the Veil to win. He couldn't let it take over his life, his soul. "I will fight," Jack said, the words steady despite the fear that still gripped him. The figure nodded once, a faint smile tugging at the corners of its mouth. "Then you must walk the path of those who have faced the Veil before you. You must learn its secrets and master them. The road will be long and filled with darkness, but you are not alone." And with that, the figure stepped back, fading into the shadows once more. The Veil's influence still lingered, but Jack now knew that he had a choice. He could choose to fight, to reclaim his soul from the darkness. And with that knowledge, a strange sense of peace washed over him, replacing the terror he had felt moments before. The battle had just begun. The town seemed quieter now, its familiar streets fading into the shadows as Jack made his way home. The weight of the Veil still pressed against him, a constant presence that haunted every step he took. The figure's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a reminder of the heavy path ahead of him. He had chosen to fight. As Jack walked, his thoughts were scattered, his heart a war zone between the terror of what he had just experienced and the quiet determination to survive. But deep down, he understood something that had become clear in the moments following the figure's departure. Fighting the Veil would not be easy. It was a battle for his very soul, a fight he couldn't win alone. But he wasn't truly alone anymore, was he? Jack's gaze shifted to the dark sky above, where the moon hung low, casting pale light over the empty streets. A faint whisper in the air reached his ears, barely audible but unmistakable. "The Veil watches, Jack. It always watches." The words sent a chill down his spine. He He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. The veil had marked him, its influence seeping into every corner of his life. His every move would be observed, every decision scrutinized. But Jack wasn't going to let that scare him. As he reached his doorstep, Jack stopped, turning to look back down the street. The darkness there was thicker than he had ever seen it, as though it were waiting for him, calling him into its depths. But this time Jack stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not afraid anymore," he said aloud, though the silence that followed felt deafening. The decision had been made. He wasn't just going to survive the veil. He was going to fight it, to the end. Jack took a deep breath and opened the door. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the shadows lurking in every corner. But for the first time since his encounter with the cloaked figure, Jack didn't feel alone. He had already begun to understand the dark world he was tangled in, and with that knowledge came the first spark of hope. It wouldn't be easy. He knew that, but he also knew he wasn't going to let the veil claim him without a fight. The veil watches, Jack, but you will make it through. With that, Jack closed the door behind him, the last sound of the night a whisper of wind that carried the faintest taste of something old, something eternal. The war had just begun, and so Jack's journey into the heart of darkness truly began. The veil was still out there, its eyes ever watchful, its grip ever tightening. But Jack was ready. He had made his choice, and as the shadows crept closer, he stepped forward, ready to face whatever horrors awaited him. Because sometimes the only way to break the darkness is to walk straight into it. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet town of Ellsworth seemed unchanged, but to Jack, everything had shifted. The veil was no longer just a shadow, it was a constant, always present, hanging over him like a storm cloud. But despite the suffocating weight of it all, Jack continued his fight. Every night he would study, researching ancient texts and rituals, desperate to find any way to break the pact. He met with the cloaked figure who had warned him, learning bits and pieces of the veil's dark history. The figure, whose true name Jack had never learned, guided him, sometimes through words, sometimes through symbols, but always with the promise that Jack could prevail, if only he was strong enough. But each day the veil grew stronger. Jack could feel it, pressing against his thoughts, twisting his dreams. He saw its influence creeping into his waking moments, in the way people around him began to act. It was as if the town itself was slowly becoming a puppet, its strings pulled by some unseen hand. At times, Jack wondered if he was the last person unaffected, if everyone else had already been claimed by the veil. One night, as Jack walked through the streets of Ellsworth, a strange quiet hung in the air. No whispers, no scraping sounds in the distance. It felt wrong. The oppressive weight of the veil had lifted, but only for a moment. Then he saw it. The Black Veil Society had returned, not in secret, but in full force. The streets were lined with figures in dark cloaks, their veils covering their faces. They were waiting. For him. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, reflecting the moon's pale glow. Jack felt his heart race. This was it. They had come for him. But Jack didn't run. He couldn't. This was his fight, his battle. He had come too far to turn back now. He stepped forward, his footsteps steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The figures parted as he walked, creating a path down the center of the street. He didn't need to be told what to do. The demon was close. Jack could feel its presence growing stronger with every step. At the end of the street stood the figure, the one who had helped him, the one who had shown him the way. It stood in silence, its head bowed as if in mourning, its hand outstretched. The moment Jack reached it, the veil around him seemed to dissolve, and for the first time since he had first encountered the veil, he understood. The demon had been here all along. It had been watching, waiting. But it wasn't just the town that had been under its control, it was Jack himself. Every step, every choice had been part of its plan. The pact had never been a curse. It was an offering, an invitation, and now the time had come. Jack stepped into the circle, his heart racing, but his resolve unwavering. "I choose to end this," he whispered. The ground trembled beneath him. The demon's presence surged, filling the air with a cold, suffocating pressure. But Jack stood tall, his hands clenched into fists, his breath steady. The figure beside him nodded once, its voice barely a whisper. "You've made your choice," it said. "But remember, not all choices can be undone. Not all darkness can be defeated." With those words, the world around Jack began to fade. The veil, the demon, the town, all of it melted into nothingness, leaving Jack standing alone in the quiet of the night. In the distance, he could hear the faintest sound of whispers. Not the veil, but something new, something that had always been there. A promise. Jack had broken the pact. But in doing so, he had become part of something far greater than he had ever imagined. And as the darkness began to close in again, Jack knew he had made his peace. The veil would watch, but Jack would never again be its puppet. Name of the next story: The Forgotten Asylum. The air was thick with a cold mist, as if the night itself had descended early. The small group of urban explorers, each armed with flashlights and cameras, huddled at the edge of the forgotten asylum. Its silhouette loomed before them, a crumbling building of gray stone, long since abandoned by both time and people. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes, staring down at them from the high walls. "Are we sure about this?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. She had been to other places, old houses, abandoned factories, but there was something about this place that unsettled her. Ethan, the group's leader, chuckled, his breath fogging in the chilly air. "Come on, Sarah. It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" "I don't know, Ethan. Something about it feels wrong," Sarah replied, taking a step back. "It's an asylum." "Of course it feels wrong," Ethan said, his voice teasing, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. The thought of exploring this place had excited him at first, but now that they were here, the creeping sense of dread was starting to settle in. Beside Sarah, Jason, who had been quiet until now, glanced at her. "He's right. It's an asylum. Just a lot of old rooms and creepy hallways. Let's get in, get some good shots, and get out." The others nodded, though Sarah still seemed uneasy. She had read stories of places like this, places that didn't just hold old memories, but something more sinister. But she wasn't about to back down now. She tightened her grip on the flashlight and followed the others as they moved toward the large iron gate that guarded the asylum's entrance. The gate creaked loudly as they pushed it open, a sound that echoed far too loudly in the stillness of the night. They stepped inside, the gravel crunching beneath their boots. The building's exterior was even more haunting up close, its walls covered in creeping ivy, windows boarded up with aged wood, and doors that hung off their hinges like they'd been left forgotten for years. As they approached the main entrance, Ethan pulled out a crowbar. "Time to get inside," he said, grinning. He pried open the rusted door with ease, and it groaned as it swung inward. The group hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The hallway stretched before them, dark and narrow, lit only by the feeble beams of their flashlights. The air smelled musty, like old paper and mold. The walls were cracked and peeling, and the floor was littered with debris. It was as if the building had been abandoned in a hurry, left to decay in isolation. "Looks like no one's been here in a long time," Jason remarked, his voice echoing unnervingly in the silence. Ethan nodded, shining his light down the hall. "Perfect. This place is a goldmine for our video." Sarah's unease grew as they moved deeper into the asylum. The building seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in odd ways, as though it had been designed to disorient anyone who entered. The further they went, the colder it became, the temperature dropping as if the walls themselves were alive with something unseen. "Hey, look at this," Jason called, shining his flashlight on a door that was ajar. The others turned to see a dark room beyond, its contents hidden by the shadows. "Should we go in?" Sarah asked, her voice soft. "Of course we should." Ethan said with a grin, pushing the door open further. "Let's see what creepy stuff we can find." They stepped inside, their flashlights sweeping across the room. It was a small office, the walls lined with decaying files and papers scattered on the floor. A desk sat in the center, covered in dust and grime, but what caught their attention was the large, blackened stain on the floor. It spread out from a spot near the desk, as though something had been spilled or smeared there long ago. "Whoa, what do you think happened here?" Jason asked, bending down to inspect the stain. "Could be blood," Sarah muttered, stepping back. "Maybe the place wasn't as abandoned as we thought." Ethan waved her off. "It's just an old stain. Let's keep going." They moved on, exploring more rooms in the asylum, each one eerily similar to the last, dim, decrepit, and full of forgotten remnants of a time long gone. But as they ventured deeper, they began to notice strange things. Odd sounds, like faint footsteps behind them, whispers carried by the wind, and the feeling of being watched. At one point, Sarah turned to find Jason a few feet behind her, his flashlight bouncing erratically. "Jason," she called, but he didn't respond. She stepped closer, her heart racing, as she reached out to touch his arm. His body was cold, unresponsive. A chill ran down her spine as she realized he was staring blankly ahead, his eyes wide with terror, but his mouth was agape, as though he was trying to scream but couldn't make a sound. "Jason," she asked again, shaking him, but he didn't move. Behind her, Ethan and the others came running. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice urgent. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. I don't know." Jason suddenly let out a strangled gasp, his body jerking as though waking from a nightmare. "I saw it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Saw what?" Ethan demanded, gripping his shoulder. "What happened?" Jason swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. "There's something here. Something in the walls. I saw it, its eyes. It's watching us. It's always been watching us." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. "I'm telling you," Jason said, his voice trembling. "There's something here. Something in the asylum. It's not empty. The patients, they never left." Ethan grabbed his camera, trying to steady his hands. "You're freaking out. This place is just old. We need to focus, get some footage, and then we'll leave." But Jason wasn't listening. He was already backing away from the others, his eyes wide with panic. "We need to get out," he insisted. "Now, before it's too late." Suddenly, the lights flickered. The air grew colder. And then, from deep within the asylum, they heard something else, something unmistakable, a loud, piercing scream. The sound of it sent a shock through the group. They froze, wide-eyed, not knowing whether to run or investigate. "That came from down the hall," Ethan said, his voice tense. "We should check it out." "I'm not going down there," Sarah said, shaking her head. "Something is wrong with this place. We need to leave." But Ethan, driven by his desire for the perfect shot, was already moving down the hall, his camera raised. "We can't leave now," he said. "This is what we came for. We're not backing out now." Reluctantly, Sarah and Jason followed him, their hearts pounding in their chests. The further they went, the darker it seemed to get. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with each step. And then they reached it, the source of the scream. A heavy iron door stood at the end of the hallway, cracked open just enough to reveal the darkness beyond. Ethan reached for the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. Inside, they saw what they had feared, rows upon rows of beds, each one occupied by a figure. Their bodies were gaunt and emaciated, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. And though their eyes were closed, Sarah could feel their gaze, thousands of eyes staring at them, empty and hollow. The room smelled of decay, of death. But it wasn't just the smell, it was the feeling that came with it, the deep sense that they weren't alone, that they had intruded on something ancient and unforgiving. Suddenly, one of the figures stirred. It was slow at first, a twitch of the hand, a shift of the head. Then, another moved, followed by another. And soon, every single one of the figures was awake, their eyes snapping open, their gazes fixed on the intruders. The group froze. A voice whispered from the darkness, low and cold, "You shouldn't have come." And then the asylum came alive. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, like a thick blanket of frost settling over them. The figures, all skeletal and pale, rose from their beds with unnatural slowness. Their movements were jerky, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings, but their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, never left the group. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her flashlight flickering erratically. Ethan, still holding his camera, stepped forward, eager to document the horror unfolding before them. "This is incredible," he muttered, but there was a tremor in his voice. Jason grabbed his arm, his grip tight. "No, Ethan. We need to get out of here. Now." But Ethan shook him off, his eyes wide with excitement. "You don't get it. This is what we came for. We can't leave yet." A low, guttural moan echoed from one of the figures. It was a sound so inhuman, it made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. The thing that made the noise was still lying in its bed, but its arms began to twitch violently, and its mouth opened with an unsettling crack, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. The air around them thickened with something darker, something ancient. Before Sarah could say anything, a hand shot out from the figure's bed, grabbing the edge of the metal frame with unnatural strength. It pulled itself forward, dragging its body across the floor, its limbs snapping in grotesque angles. "Get back!" Jason screamed, shoving Sarah away from the crawling figure. But it didn't matter. The room seemed to close in on them. More of the patients, if they could even be called that, were moving now. They were slow, yes, but the energy they radiated was thick with malice. The first one who moved reached out, grabbing Sarah's ankle with a cold, bony hand. Her scream echoed in the silence of the asylum as she tried to pull her leg free, but the grip was unyielding. "Ethan! Jason!" she screamed, panic rising in her throat. But both men were too transfixed by the scene in front of them, their eyes wide, as if they had been caught in a trance. Jason pulled her back, tugging her away from the creature. But as soon as they moved, another figure shot forward, its mouth snapping open as it lunged for them, its body contorted in ways that defied reason. "Move!" Ethan shouted, suddenly shaking off his dazed stupor. He turned, his flashlight catching one of the figures square in the face, and the thing let out a sharp hiss, recoiling into the shadows. "Run!" Jason cried, shoving Sarah toward the door. They bolted toward the hallway, their steps frantic as the air grew heavier, the darkness pressing against them like a suffocating weight. Behind them, the figures were coming to life, one after another, rising from their beds, their movements becoming faster, more deliberate, as though they were hunting. "Where's the exit?" Sarah gasped, her voice raw with fear. She could feel her heart in her throat, the blood pounding in her ears. "Just keep running," Ethan shouted. "It's this way. I remember the layout of the building. We'll find a way out." But the asylum didn't seem to end. Hallways stretched out endlessly, curving and twisting in ways that made no sense. Every corner they turned, every door they tried, only led them further into the labyrinthine nightmare. They ran through halls lined with peeling wallpaper, broken doors, and cracked windows, their footsteps echoing like drumbeats in the eerie silence. The figures were close now, their distorted bodies closing in on them, their movements becoming faster and more purposeful. Jason turned a corner, looking behind him. "They're right behind us," he shouted, his breath ragged. "We're not going to make it. Keep going," Ethan urged, his voice tight with panic. "We can't stop." But as they pushed forward, a sharp sound echoed from somewhere deep in the asylum, like metal scraping against metal. It was followed by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she looked around. Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the darkness seemed to pulse with life. "I don't know," Jason said, his eyes wide. "But it's not good." The growl came again, louder this time. It felt like the entire building was alive with an unseen presence, something far older than the figures chasing them, something far more powerful. The air thickened with a sense of impending doom, like the asylum itself was about to swallow them whole. "Move! Faster!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking with fear. They ran, their legs burning with exhaustion, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah could hear the sound of footsteps behind them, slow and heavy, getting closer. She turned, her flashlight catching one of the figures. Its eyes gleamed with something otherworldly, and its mouth curled into a twisted grin. It wasn't just a patient anymore. It was something more, something that had been twisted by the darkness of the asylum. Just when it seemed like they couldn't go any further, they reached a set of stairs leading down into the basement. The door was half open, and for a moment, it seemed like a way out, a way to escape. "This way!" Ethan shouted, grabbing the door handle. He pulled it open, and the three of them spilled into the dark, descending into the basement below. The stairs creaked under their weight as they hurried down, the shadows growing deeper and colder with each step. The air down here was damp, and the smell was worse, like rot and decay. Jason stopped, his eyes scanning the space around them. "Where are we? What is this place?" "Don't stop. Keep moving," Ethan urged, already moving toward the far wall where there was another door. "We'll find another exit. Just." But then, from the darkness ahead, they heard it, a low chilling laugh. It was deep, guttural, and it echoed off the walls, reverberating through the basement like the voice of something ancient. Jason froze, his eyes wide. What the hell was that? Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them trembled. The walls seemed to shift, and from the far end of the basement, something began to emerge, a shape, dark and shifting, moving toward them with an unnatural speed. The shadows seemed to stretch toward it, as though it was pulling them in. The very air felt alive, like it was suffocating them. And then they saw it. It was a figure, but not like the others. This one was larger, its form a mass of shifting shadows and writhing shapes. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a grotesque mask of cracked skin and hollow eyes, its mouth twisted into a permanent snarl. "It's not human," Sarah whispered, backing away. "No," Ethan breathed, his voice trembling. "It's something worse, something older." The figure advanced, its presence crushing, suffocating, like a nightmare made flesh. Every movement it made sent a ripple of darkness through the room, distorting everything in its wake. "Run!" Jason screamed, turning toward the stairs. But it was too late. The figure lunged forward, its hands reaching out with an unnatural speed, and in that moment, the world seemed to collapse. The light from their flashlights flickered and went out, plunging them into complete darkness. The last thing Sarah heard before the darkness consumed them was the sound of that awful, mocking laugh, echoing through the walls of the asylum. The cold darkness wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket, pressing in from all sides. Sarah could feel the weight of it, thick and oppressive, as though the very air in the room had turned against them. The sound of her ragged breathing was the only thing she could focus on, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it drowned out everything else. She could feel the others near her, Jason, Ethan, but they seemed so distant, as if the shadows between them were growing wider with each passing second. The silence that followed was heavy, and though her mind screamed for her to move, her body refused to respond. Then, through the silence, a faint sound. It was almost imperceptible at first, a rustling, like dry leaves scraping against each other. But it grew louder and closer. Sarah's eyes strained to adjust to the inky blackness, but there was nothing to see. No figures, no shapes, just the feeling of being watched followed. The rustling stopped, and for a brief moment, everything fell silent once again. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance. It was small at first, like the glow of a dying ember, but it grew stronger. The light was accompanied by a low, scraping sound, like metal dragging against stone. As the light inched closer, Sarah realized it was a lantern, swaying from side to side as though carried by someone or something. Ethan's voice, hoarse and panicked, broke through the darkness. "What is that? Who's there?" Sarah could feel the tension in the air, thick and dangerous. The lantern swayed closer still, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The light revealed nothing but emptiness, but the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and twisting unnaturally. "Stay close," Jason whispered, his breath shallow. They edged forward, eyes glued to the lantern, which continued to sway closer. And then, as it neared, Sarah saw the figure holding it, an old woman, bent and frail, her face obscured by a long black veil. Her clothing was tattered, her hands shaking as she gripped the lantern with a tight, trembling hold. But it was her eyes that froze Sarah in place. Hollow and dark, like the endless void. There was nothing human left behind. The woman took a slow step forward, and in a voice that sounded like it came from the very depths of the earth, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask who she was or what was going on, but the words got stuck in her throat. Instead, she found herself stepping back, unable to look away from the woman's eyes. Ethan, despite the terror in his own voice, tried to approach the woman. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What is this place?" The old woman tilted her head, her veil rustling as she did. Her smile, if it could be called a smile, was stretched and unnatural. "This place is ours, and you are not welcome." The lantern flickered wildly, casting odd shadows on the walls, and Sarah felt the temperature drop even further. The air became thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and the darkness around them seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls of the basement seemed to close in, shifting like the asylum itself was alive, hungry for their fear. "Run!" Jason screamed, his hand shooting out to grab Sarah. But before they could move, the old woman raised a hand, and everything stopped. The light from the lantern intensified, blinding them, and the figures in the shadows stirred again, emerging from the corners of the room. They weren't the same as the patients they had seen before. These figures were different, taller, more grotesque, their bodies twisted and misshapen in ways that made Sarah's stomach churn. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and their movements were faster now, too fast for anything human. The woman's voice rang out again, louder this time, as if she were speaking directly into their minds. "They were promised, and now you will be too." With a swift motion, she swung the lantern in front of her, and the room seemed to tremble. The light expanded outward, covering the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, revealing an impossible scene. The figures, the patients, had gathered again, forming a circle around them. Their faces were twisted with hunger, their eyes gleaming in the dark. "No!" Ethan cried out, but his voice was swallowed by the rising crescendo of whispers that filled the room. The figures began to chant, their voices a low, almost hypnotic hum. Sarah felt herself being drawn toward them, as though invisible strings were pulling her in, making it impossible to resist. She stumbled, her legs heavy, her mind swimming with fear. Jason grabbed her arm. "Don't listen to them," he muttered, trying to break the trance-like hold that seemed to grip them. But it was no use. The woman with the lantern stepped forward, her presence overwhelming. She raised the lantern higher, casting a final, blinding light that enveloped everything. The chanting grew louder, and Sarah felt the darkness inside her growing too. The voices in the room filled her mind, her thoughts becoming fragmented. It was as if the very fabric of her reality was starting to tear apart. And then, the ground beneath them began to shift. The asylum had never been abandoned. The asylum had never been empty. It was a place where souls were trapped, bound to the darkness. trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering. And now, Sarah realized she was becoming one of them. The old woman's voice echoed through her mind, final and cold. You were never meant to leave. None of you were. With those words, the light from the lantern flickered one last time, and everything went black. Sarah's scream was the last sound to be heard, swallowed by the depths of the asylum. The darkness that followed felt like an eternity. Time seemed to bend, stretching into an endless void. Sarah could feel herself being pulled, her body weightless, floating through nothingness. Her heart raced, the panic surging within her, but there was no escape. The air around her was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere were alive, pressing against her from all sides. Then, with a sudden jolt, she was slammed back into her body. Her eyes snapped open, but she couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The last thing she remembered was the lantern, the woman, the figures, but now everything was still. The silence was deafening. She was no longer in the basement. In fact, she wasn't sure where she was at all. She tried to move, but her limbs were stiff, unresponsive, as if they were frozen in place. Panic clawed at her throat as her mind scrambled to make sense of her surroundings. The walls were dark, but not like the thick, oppressive blackness of the basement. This was something different, something colder. The shadows here didn't move. They seemed to absorb all light, leaving nothing but an impenetrable void. Her breath hitched when she realized she wasn't alone. The silhouettes around her were barely perceptible at first, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw them more clearly. Figures hunched and twisted, standing still like statues in the shadows. There were more of them than she could count, all of them watching her with empty, lifeless eyes. She recognized some of them. They were the patients from the asylum, their faces twisted in strange, unsettling expressions. But they were different now. Their eyes didn't blink, their bodies didn't move. They were frozen, caught in a moment between time and space, their very existence locked in an eternal, lifeless stare. But one figure stepped forward. It was a man, tall and thin, his form almost skeletal. His face was covered by a veil, the same black veil Sarah had seen earlier. He moved with unnatural grace, as if the air itself parted for him. And though his face was obscured, Sarah could feel his gaze upon her, cold and calculating. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice smooth like silk. It sent a chill down her spine, the words wrapping around her like a constricting rope. "None of you should have come." Sarah tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. She could only stare at him, her body still refusing to move. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, until he finally stepped closer. "You've seen what's been hidden," he continued. "You've seen the truth behind these walls. And now you are ours." With those words, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. They twisted and writhed, moving with purpose, crawling toward her from every corner. Her mind screamed, but her body remained immobile, her muscles frozen in terror. The figures, the patients, the twisted, grotesque creatures, they were all coming for her. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, their mouths twisted into grotesque, toothless smiles. The man with the veil leaned in closer, his breath cold against her ear. "You are a part of this now," he whispered. "You will never leave. You will never escape." A loud crack echoed through the room as one of the figures stepped forward, a woman with a distorted face, her features almost unrecognizable. She reached out, her hands skeletal and clawed, and grasped Sarah's shoulder. The coldness of her touch was like ice, sending a shock of terror through Sarah's spine. She tried to pull away, but the woman's grip tightened, and before Sarah could react, she was pulled toward the center of the room. The shadows pressed in on all sides, suffocating, choking. The veil-clad man raised his hand, and the room grew darker still, the light fading until only the faintest glimmer of the lantern remained. The patients, no longer just patients, but something else, something far worse, began to chant in low, guttural voices, their words unintelligible, but filled with a dark power that made Sarah's head spin. Their chant seemed to vibrate through her very bones, each word resonating deep within her chest. "You've seen too much," the man said, his voice echoing in her mind. "You can't leave. You belong to us now. Forever." Sarah's vision blurred as the shadows closed in. She could feel their cold hands brushing against her skin, their whispers crawling into her mind. She felt as though her soul was being torn from her body, ripped apart by the very darkness that surrounded her. The chanting grew louder, more intense, until it became all-encompassing, drowning out everything else. Then, with one final, ear-splitting scream, everything stopped. The room fell silent. The shadows vanished. The figures disappeared. Sarah was alone. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air was thick, but there was no longer any oppressive weight pressing down on her. The shadows had retreated, leaving only the faintest traces of their presence. The patients, the man in the veil, they were all gone. But something had changed. Sarah could feel it, an emptiness inside her, a hollow space where her fear once was. Her body, once frozen in place, now felt strangely light, as though the very essence of who she was had been stripped away. The room around her was still, but her mind was reeling. What had just happened? Was she still trapped? Was she still alive? She reached out, her hand trembling, and found a door. It was wooden, aged, and cold to the touch, but it was there. She didn't hesitate. She pushed it open, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway beyond was dark, but it was real, solid. It was a way out. With one last glance at the room she had been trapped in, Sarah stepped through the door, the weight of the darkness lifting as she left the shadows behind. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The memories of what she had seen, of the horrors she had witnessed, would follow her forever. The asylum might have been forgotten by the world, but it would never be forgotten by her. As she walked away, her mind kept repeating the same thought over and over. The patients never left, and neither did I. As Sarah stumbled through the hallway, each step felt heavier than the last. Her body seemed to be moving on its own accord, her legs carrying her forward despite the weight pressing down on her chest. The darkness around her was thick, but it wasn't the same kind of darkness she had encountered before. This one wasn't oppressive, it was suffocating. It clung to her skin, burrowing into her mind, whispering in her ear. The air grew colder with each passing second, the temperature dropping sharply. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and she hugged her arms around herself, trying to stave off the creeping chill. Every inch of the hallway was coated in shadow, but it wasn't the kind that offered comfort. It felt wrong, as though the very walls themselves were watching her, judging her for daring to leave. She had to get out. She had to. But where was the exit? How had she ended up so far from where she'd started? The hallway stretched endlessly before her, twisting and winding in unnatural directions. The sense of disorientation was overwhelming, and Sarah's head began to swim. She pressed a hand against the wall, grounding herself, trying to steady her nerves. Then she heard it, a soft scuffling sound from behind her. It was faint at first, like the sound of footsteps shuffling against the floor. But as she turned, her pulse quickened. The hallway was empty. No one was there. She stood perfectly still, straining her ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It had been too distinct to ignore. But there was nothing in sight. The silence returned, almost too quickly, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. You're not alone. The thought flashed through her mind like a cold, sharp knife, and she couldn't shake it. She wanted to scream, to turn around and run, but something in her gut told her that running would be worse. Something was following her, something that was not human. She could feel it, that weight of something unseen, moving just beyond her reach, its presence pressing in on her like a vice. She took a tentative step forward, her hand trembling against the wall. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to listen to the voices that were growing louder in her head. Leave now. Go back. But there was no turning back. She knew that. The moment she had stepped through the door, she had crossed an invisible line. There was no going back to the world she had known. With a shaky breath, Sarah pushed forward, determined to find a way out, even as the shadows seemed to stretch further into the darkness, consuming the hallway in a slow, creeping tide. Another noise, this time louder, a scraping sound, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, heart hammering, but again there was nothing. No one. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure. Just a glimpse of movement in the far distance. A shadow, tall and thin, walking down the hallway toward her with slow, deliberate steps. Its body was too thin, too unnatural, and the way it moved, it didn't belong here. It was coming closer. Her blood turned to ice as she stood frozen, staring at the figure. There was no mistaking it. It was one of them, the patients. The ones with the hollow eyes, the twisted faces. But it wasn't the woman with the lantern. This figure was different. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it was no longer bound by the laws of physics. Its steps were erratic, disjointed, like the movement of something that had long since stopped being human. The air around her felt heavier, thick with the presence of something dark, something ancient. The figure moved closer, its feet dragging against the floor with a sickening rasp. The sound sent a wave of nausea through Sarah. She turned quickly, scrambling to move forward, but her feet felt like they were stuck in place, as if the floor had turned to mud. Another scraping sound. Closer now. It was coming for her. She broke into a run, her heart pounding in her ears, each step feeling like it was pushing her further into the abyss. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of her, but no matter how fast she ran, the figure was always there, just behind her, following her with unnatural precision. The floor beneath her feet seemed to warp, and the walls began to close in. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and panic surged through her veins. As she ran, the shadows seemed to multiply. Other figures, other patients, those same twisted, grotesque shapes, appeared in her peripheral vision. They were walking toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes glowing in the dark. She could hear their whispers, soft and unintelligible, as though they were speaking in unison, but it was too much, too overwhelming. The walls were closing in, and the hallway seemed to stretch and contract, twisting like a living, breathing thing. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was run. The lantern. The woman. She was coming for you. Sarah felt a rush of terror that made her stomach turn. She had seen the woman with the lantern. She had seen the twisted figures. She had seen it all. And now, it was all coming for her. Her vision blurred as she ran, the darkness swallowing everything around her. She could feel the presence closing in, could feel the cold, grasping hands reaching for her. She didn't know how much longer she could keep running. Then suddenly the hallway shifted again. The air grew warmer. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a soft, flickering light. The walls stopped closing in. The oppressive weight seemed to lift, and Sarah realized, with a jolt, that she was no longer running. She had stopped moving entirely. The light before her revealed a door. It was simple, wooden, but it looked like a way out. She could feel it deep in her bones. This was the exit. But something in her resisted. Something deep within her told her not to open it. She stood there for a moment, staring at the door, her pulse hammering in her chest. She could feel the eyes on her, the presence of the others, lurking just behind her, waiting. They wanted her to open the door. They wanted her to step through it. But Sarah couldn't. She couldn't take another step. And then the door opened. The door creaked open slowly, as though reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The light spilling from the crack between the door and the frame was dim, faint, but it felt warm, almost inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating darkness that surrounded Sarah. She didn't want to move. Every part of her screamed to run, to get away, but she couldn't. Her feet felt frozen to the floor. Then the whispers grew louder. They were no longer distant, but close, surrounding her, their words a garbled mess of unintelligible murmurs. Her head throbbed, her vision spinning as she turned her eyes back to the door. A soft, almost melodic voice rose from the cacophony of whispers. It was calm, soothing, like a lullaby, but there was something sinister hiding beneath the sweetness. "Come in, child." The voice was unmistakable. It was the woman with the lantern. The words crawled into her mind, and before she could stop herself, her hand reached for the door. It was like an unseen force had taken control of her body, guiding her toward that light, toward the safety it promised. The pull was irresistible, and Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken as she stepped closer. The room beyond the door was dark, utterly dark. No light, no warmth. Only the faintest echo of the woman's voice, now a whisper again. "Come to me." Sarah stepped over the threshold, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft thud. She spun around, but the door had vanished. There was no exit now, no way back. The air felt suffocating, dense with the same oppressive presence that had haunted her since she set foot in the asylum. Then she saw it. The lantern. The woman. She stood in the far corner of the room, her silhouette faintly illuminated by the flickering light of the lantern she held in front of her. The woman's face was obscured by shadows, but Sarah could see the glimmer of her pale eyes, cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce into her very soul. The woman stepped forward, her footfalls silent, as though her feet didn't even touch the ground. Sarah tried to move, tried to run, but her legs refused to cooperate. She was trapped, frozen in place, as the woman advanced slowly, deliberately. "Do you know why you're here?" the woman asked, her voice smooth, almost soothing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. I don't know. You're here because you were meant to be," the woman said, her voice like a soft caress. "All of you who wander into this place are meant to be here. We've been waiting for you. Waiting for me?" Sarah repeated, her voice trembling. The woman nodded, her face still hidden in shadow. "Yes, for you and for the others. You came looking for answers, but now you've found the truth." The truth. The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she tried to process what the woman had said. The truth. What truth? The lantern flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls like living things. And then Sarah saw it. Behind the woman, the walls were covered in symbols. Strange, twisted markings, etched into the stone with a precision that made her stomach churn. Symbols she didn't recognize, but they felt ancient. They felt wrong. "The patients never left, you see," the woman continued, her voice still that quiet, melodic whisper. "They're here, waiting for the pact to be fulfilled. You're here to join them." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as the woman's words sank in. A pact? What pact? The air seemed to thicken around her, and she could feel the presence of something else. Something larger than the woman, something ancient, something alive. The woman raised the lantern higher, the light now casting grotesque shadows across the walls, revealing more of the symbols. As the light flickered, the shadows in the room began to twist, as though they were trying to take shape. Sarah could feel them moving, creeping closer. "Those who come to us," the woman said, her voice now colder, "are never the same when they leave." "Leave?" Sarah gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't leave. You won't leave," the woman corrected. "Not now. Not after everything you've seen. You're part of the pact now, Sarah." The room around her seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in closer as the woman's words settled like a weight on her chest. Panic surged through Sarah's veins as the reality of the situation dawned on her. She was never meant to escape. There was no escape from this place. She was a part of it now. As the woman took a step forward, Sarah's vision blurred. Her head swam, and the world around her seemed to dissolve. She could feel the shadows wrapping around her, curling around her limbs like chains, and the lantern's light seemed to grow brighter, hotter. The air thickened, and Sarah gasped for breath, the pressure unbearable. "No, no," she whispered, her voice breaking as she struggled against the invisible force that held her in place. "You were always meant to be here," the woman said again, her voice growing louder now, echoing in Sarah's ears. "Just like all the others." And then, as if in response to the woman's words, the shadows in the room lunged at her. They wrapped around her body, squeezing, pulling her down to the floor. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, her body going limp as the shadows consumed her. The lantern's light flickered one last time, casting a brief, harsh glow across the room, revealing the twisted faces of the patients. Their hollow eyes watched her, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles, as they surrounded her, pulling her into their cold, unfeeling embrace. And then silence. The room was empty once more, save for the faint flicker of the lantern in the center of the room, casting long shadows on the walls. The asylum stood still, waiting for the next soul to wander in, waiting for the next pact to be fulfilled. For the forgotten asylum never truly slept. It was always hungry. The silence in the asylum stretched on, thick and suffocating, as though the very walls were holding their breath. But something shifted. The air felt heavier, the shadows seemed to pulse, alive and waiting. The faint flicker of the lantern in the middle of the room was the only sign of life, if it could even be called life at all. The whispers returned, soft at first, like the wind brushing against old windows. They grew louder, though sharper, more insistent, swirling around the room like a gathering storm. They were everywhere now, filling the space with their unintelligible murmurs. But Sarah wasn't listening. Her mind was fogged, her body numb, still tangled in the shadow's grip. The darkness pressed in, thickening, suffocating, until she could barely breathe. Then, from the edge of her vision, she saw movement. At first, it was just a shape, a figure standing motionless in the far corner of the room. It was barely there, a shifting silhouette that seemed to melt into the shadows. But as it stepped forward, Sarah's breath hitched. It was one of them, one of the patients. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking, filled with a hollow emptiness that chilled Sarah to the bone. His mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, his lips cracked and dry. His skin hung loosely from his bones, like an old, tattered garment. "Help me," the patient rasped, his voice a hoarse whisper, almost too soft to hear. Sarah's pulse quickened, her body finally responding to the terror that gripped her. She wanted to scream, to run, but the shadows still held her captive. Her legs refused to move, her arms bound by an unseen force. "Please," the patient begged again, his voice growing louder. "We're all waiting. We're waiting for you." Sarah's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no sound escaped her lips. She could only watch, helpless, as the patient took another step toward her, his eyes locked onto hers. He reached out a bony hand, his fingers long and twisted. His touch was cold, like ice, sending a shiver down her spine. As his hand brushed against her cheek, she could feel the faintest pulse of something inside her, a slow, terrible thrum, as if something was stirring deep within her. "We never leave," the patient whispered. "Not until it's done." "Well, what do you mean?" Sarah managed to gasp, her voice barely audible. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that might help her escape. But there was nothing. The walls were closing in, the shadows growing longer, darker. The patient's smile widened, revealing yellowed, jagged teeth. "You'll see," he murmured. "You'll see soon enough." And with that, he was gone. But Sarah could still feel him. The coldness lingered on her skin, and the whispers grew louder, clearer, as if they were coming from every direction. Her head swam, and her vision began to blur once again. The pressure on her chest intensified, the weight of the darkness becoming unbearable. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the terror that had consumed her. But when she opened them again, the room had changed. The walls no longer looked old and decayed, but pristine, as if the asylum was still in its prime. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, the hum of fluorescent lights above. But it felt wrong, out of place, like a memory that had been forced into her mind. And then she saw them, the patients. They were all around her, their eyes wide, their faces frozen in expressions of anguish. They stood in the corners of the room, watching her, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. "You're not like them," one of them whispered, his voice sharp and insistent. "You're different. You're not supposed to be here." "Please, I don't understand," Sarah's voice cracked, her throat raw from screaming, from trying to break free. "What do you want from me?" The patients didn't answer. Instead, they stepped closer, their eyes never leaving hers. Their presence was suffocating, overwhelming. Sarah could feel the weight of their gaze on her, feel the emptiness inside them pressing in from all sides. The lantern in the center of the room flickered again, casting its warm, ghostly light across the figures surrounding her. And as the light shifted, Sarah saw it, written on the floor beneath her, etched into the stone in dark, bloody letters. The pact. She couldn't read the symbols, but she knew what they meant. She could feel them pulling at her, wrapping themselves around her like the shadows that had bound her earlier. The whispers rose again, louder now, chanting the words of the pact, their voices a cacophony of despair and hunger. "You were never meant to leave." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she stumbled backward, her heart racing, her hands trembling. She turned, her eyes darting around the room, desperate for an escape. But the door was gone. There was no way out. Only the patients, their hollow eyes watching her, waiting. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want this." But the patients were already moving closer, their fingers reaching out, their cold hands brushing against her skin. One by one, they surrounded her, their whispers growing louder, more urgent, until the noise was deafening. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to scream, to fight, but it was no use. The darkness had already taken hold. And then the lantern went out. The room was plunged into total darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no movement. Just an oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. But then Sarah heard it, a soft, steady breathing coming from all around her. The patients had gathered, their cold hands gripping her, pulling her down into the darkness. She could feel their breath on her skin, could hear the faint whispers, growing louder, more desperate. The pact was complete, and Sarah, like the others before her, would never leave. The asylum had claimed her. The silence in the asylum stretched on, thick and suffocating, as though the very walls were holding their breath. But something shifted. The air felt heavier, the shadows seemed to pulse, alive and waiting. The faint flicker of the lantern in the middle of the room was the only sign of life, if it could even be called life at all. The whispers returned, soft at first, like the wind brushing against old windows. They grew louder, though sharper, more insistent, swirling around the room like a gathering storm. They were everywhere now, filling the space with their unintelligible murmurs. But Sarah wasn't listening. Her mind was fogged, her body numb, still tangled in the shadow's grip. The darkness pressed in, thickening, suffocating, until she could barely breathe. Then, from the edge of her vision, she saw movement. At first, it was just a shape, a figure standing motionless in the far corner of the room. It was barely there, a shifting silhouette that seemed to melt into the shadows. But as it stepped forward, Sarah's breath hitched. It was one of them, one of the patients. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking, filled with a hollow emptiness that chilled Sarah to the bone. His mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, his lips cracked and dry. His skin hung loosely from his bones, like an old, tattered garment. "Help me," the patient rasped, his voice a hoarse whisper, almost too soft to hear. Sarah's pulse quickened, her body finally responding to the terror that gripped her. She wanted to scream, to run, but the shadows still held her captive. Her legs refused to move, her arms bound by an unseen force. "Please," the patient begged again, his voice growing louder. "We're all waiting. We're waiting for you." Sarah's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no sound escaped her lips. She could only watch, helpless, as the patient took another step toward her, his eyes locked onto hers. He reached out a bony hand, his fingers long and twisted. His touch was cold like ice, sending a shiver down her spine. As his hand brushed against her cheek, she could feel the faintest pulse of something inside her, a slow, terrible thrum, as if something was stirring deep within her. "We never leave," the patient whispered. "Not until it's done." "Well, what do you mean?" Sarah managed to gasp, her voice barely audible. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that might help her escape. But there was nothing. The walls were closing in, the shadows growing longer, darker. The patient's smile widened, revealing yellowed, jagged teeth. "You'll see," he murmured. "You'll see soon enough." And with that, he was gone. But Sarah could still feel him. The coldness lingered on her skin, and the whispers grew louder, clearer, as if they were coming from every direction. Her head swam, and her vision began to blur once again. The pressure on her chest intensified, the weight of the darkness becoming unbearable. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the terror that had consumed her. But when she opened them again, the room had changed. The walls no longer looked old and decayed, but pristine, as if the asylum was still in its prime. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, the hum of fluorescent lights above. But it felt wrong, out of place, like a memory that had been forced into her mind. And then she saw them, the patients. They were all around her, their eyes wide, their faces frozen in expressions of anguish. They stood in the corners of the room, watching her, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. "You're not like them," one of them whispered, his voice sharp and insistent. "You're different. You're not supposed to be here." "Please, I don't understand," Sarah's voice cracked, her throat raw from screaming, from trying to break free. "What do you want from me?" The patients didn't answer. Instead, they stepped closer, their eyes never leaving hers. Their presence was suffocating, overwhelming. Sarah could feel the weight of their gaze on her, feel the emptiness inside them pressing in from all sides. The lantern in the center of the room flickered again, casting its warm, ghostly light across the figures surrounding her. And as the light shifted, Sarah saw it, written on the floor beneath her, etched into the stone in dark, bloody letters. The pact. She couldn't read the symbols, but she knew what they meant. She could feel them pulling at her, wrapping themselves around her like the shadows that had bound her earlier. The whispers rose again, louder now, chanting the words of the pact, their voices a cacophony of despair and hunger. "You were never meant to leave." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she stumbled backward, her heart racing, her hands trembling. She turned, her eyes darting around the room, desperate for an escape. But the door was gone. There was no way out. Only the patients, their hollow eyes watching her, waiting. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want this." But the patients were already moving closer, their fingers reaching out, their cold hands brushing against her skin. One by one they surrounded her, their whispers growing louder, more urgent, until the noise was deafening. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to scream, to fight, but it was no use. The darkness had already taken hold. And then the lantern went out. The room was plunged into total darkness. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no light, no movement. Just an oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. But then Sarah heard it. A soft, steady breathing coming from all around her. The patients had gathered, their cold hands gripping her, pulling her down into the darkness. She could feel their breath on her skin, could hear the faint whispers, growing louder, more desperate. The pact was complete, and Sarah, like the others before her, would never leave. The asylum had claimed her. The darkness was absolute. It was a suffocating, pressing void that seemed to stretch on for miles. Sarah could feel the coldness surrounding her, the weight of it pressing down, filling her lungs with the chill of death. She tried to move, to scream, but her body was paralyzed, as though the very air around her had become a shackle. But then something shifted. A faint glimmer of light flickered in the distance, far off, barely noticeable in the endless void. Sarah's heart raced, her eyes straining to see, to understand what it was. Slowly, as if in a dream, the light grew brighter, sharper, until it took the form of a figure, a shadowy shape standing just beyond the reach of her senses. Her pulse quickened. She reached out, her fingers trembling, as though she could touch the light itself, as if it might lead her to salvation. But the figure didn't move. Instead, it stood there watching her. "Help me," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, help me." The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, a hollow presence in the darkness, its eyes, if it had eyes, locked onto her. The closer she tried to get, the further it seemed to retreat, as if pulling away just beyond her grasp. And then she understood. It wasn't real. It wasn't trying to help her. It was part of the asylum, part of the ritual. The breath caught in her throat. She knew, without a doubt, that the figure wasn't a person. It wasn't human. It was a manifestation of the pact, an echo of the twisted ritual that had bound her to this place. A part of the darkness that surrounded her, feeding on her fear and helplessness. Sarah staggered backward, her mind spinning as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever. The patients, they were all around her, their voices rising in a frenzied chorus. The sound of their chanting filled her ears, and the words, though foreign, were unmistakable in their intent. "We were here long before you. We were the first. Now, you're one of us." Her blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The patients, the ones who had never left, they weren't trapped here by accident. They were here because of the pact, the same dark covenant that had ensnared her. They were bound to the asylum, just as she was now, part of a never-ending cycle of suffering and despair. Her legs buckled, and she fell to the ground, her hands scraping across the cold, rough stone. She wanted to scream, to beg, but the words died in her throat. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, more insistent, until it felt as though the walls themselves were vibrating with the force of their words. "You cannot escape," they said. "None of us can." The light that had seemed like salvation now felt like a trap. Sarah could feel the air growing colder, the walls pressing in on her, suffocating her. The darkness was no longer just around her, it was inside her, burrowing into her skin, crawling into her soul. The lantern she had seen earlier reappeared in the distance, flickering with a sickly yellow glow. It hovered just out of reach, as if daring her to approach. She didn't want to go near it. She didn't want anything to do with this place anymore. But her body moved of its own accord. It was as if the asylum had taken control, guiding her toward the very thing that would finish what had begun. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied. Sarah's mind reeled as she stumbled forward, drawn like a moth to a flame. As she neared the lantern, a hand reached out from the darkness, grabbing her by the wrist. She gasped, the cold fingers digging into her skin, pulling her toward the center of the room. "No! No!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw and desperate. But the hand didn't relent. It dragged her forward, and in that moment she realized it wasn't one of the patients. It wasn't any of them. It was something else. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the coldness tighten around her wrist. The figure emerged from the shadows, towering over her, its form shifting and writhing. It was no longer human, no longer anything recognizable. It was an embodiment of the asylum, a manifestation of the pact that had ensnared her. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were like endless black voids, swallowing everything they gazed upon. Its mouth stretched wide, too wide, filled with jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. "You are ours," it hissed, its voice a low, guttural sound that vibrated in Sarah's bones. "You cannot run. You will never escape." Terror surged through Sarah as she struggled against its grip, but it was no use. The more she fought, the stronger the force became. The darkness closed in, suffocating her as the figure drew her closer. The lantern flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. And then, with a sudden, bone-chilling crack, the light went out completely, plunging Sarah into a darkness deeper than she had ever known. She felt her body jerk violently, and before she could fully process what was happening, the room seemed to collapse in on itself, as though the walls were caving in, closing her off from the rest of the world. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the whispering, growing louder and louder, until it was all she could hear. The whispers of the patients, the whispers of the asylum. And then all at once they stopped. Sarah was lost. The silence was overwhelming. It enveloped Sarah, suffocating her, as if the very air had vanished, leaving her stranded in a void where time had no meaning. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the thick, oppressive stillness pressing down on her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Her mind was a fog of confusion, disoriented by the suffocating blackness that had swallowed her whole. But then, ever so faintly, something stirred. A whisper, barely a sound, but it was there, curling around her consciousness like a snake, slow and deliberate. Sarah felt it, felt the weight of it pressing against her ears, and then from the darkness a voice emerged, a low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated her bones. "You cannot escape." The words were thick with malice, like poison dripping from a serpent's fangs. Her heart hammered in her chest, panic rising in her throat. She had heard this before, the same words, the same tone, from the figure that had dragged her toward the lantern. But now it was different. The voice was everywhere, all around her, swirling in the blackness like an ancient curse. "You are part of us now," it continued, the voice growing stronger, as though the very darkness was feeding it. "You belong to the asylum. You are one of the forgotten." Sarah's breathing quickened, each inhale sharp and shallow. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. All she knew was the cold, the silence, the suffocating presence that pressed in on her from every direction. The whispers returned, a low chorus rising in volume, surrounding her like 1,000 voices calling from the deep. The patients, they were still here, trapped in the same endless cycle, bound by the same pact. And now, she was one of them, a part of this place, this nightmare, forever. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "No, please." But the voice, the presence, only grew louder, more insistent. She felt a tug, a strange pull deep inside her chest, like something was drawing her closer to the darkness that had consumed her. Her body moved on its own, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings, dragging her toward the heart of the asylum. The whispers continued, an endless stream of voices chanting the same words over and over again. "You are ours. You are one of us." And then the blackness parted, just for a moment. In that instant, Sarah saw it. The room. The asylum. It was back to the way it had been, but now, everything was distorted. The walls were bending, twisting, as if the very structure of the building was warping under the weight of the curse. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the flickering light from the lantern cast long, erratic shadows that twisted like living things. The patients were there too, their hollow eyes staring at her, their faces stretched in grotesque smiles. "Join us," one of them said, his voice nothing more than a rasp. "You are one of us now." The others echoed his words, their voices blending together into a single, monstrous sound. Sarah's body felt numb, her limbs heavy as though they had been submerged in ice. She could barely move, barely breathe, but she was aware of everything around her, of the dark presence that had claimed her. Her soul, her very essence, was slipping away, consumed by the asylum's hunger. It wasn't just the building. It wasn't just the patients. The asylum was alive, feeding, growing stronger with each soul it claimed, and Sarah had become its newest prisoner. In her fading moments of clarity, Sarah tried to scream, to break free, but it was no use. The shadows closed in around her, swallowing her whole. She felt the pull of the pact, its cold, unyielding grip, dragging her down, deeper into the darkness. And then, as the last bit of light was consumed, the whispers faded into nothing. The asylum had claimed another soul. The next day, the group of urban explorers, now completely unaware of what had happened to Sarah, arrived back at the edge of the town, shaken and disturbed by the eerie silence they had encountered inside the asylum. They had found the old building abandoned, just as they had expected. The floors creaked underfoot, the walls were crumbling, but there was no sign of life. No sign of Sarah. The place was empty, abandoned, or so it seemed. But if they had lingered just a little longer, if they had stepped beyond the threshold, they would have heard it. The whispers, low, distant, and unending, calling out to anyone who would listen. For those who entered, the asylum never lets go. And Sarah, like so many before her, was a part of it now. Forever lost, forever forgotten. As the group of explorers walked away from the asylum, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The building seemed quieter now, too still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. None of them spoke about it, but there was an unspoken tension between them, a shared sense of unease that none of them could escape. They didn't notice it at first, but as they made their way through the thick trees toward the main road, they felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. It was as if the forest itself had eyes, its shadows stretching and shifting around them, closing in on their every step. "It's too quiet," Ben muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Yeah, I feel it too," Rachel said, nervously glancing around. Her hand instinctively gripped her flashlight tighter. "We should have found Sarah by now," Jamie added, his face pale. The group stopped in their tracks. No one had said it aloud, but they all knew. Sarah was still missing. She had gone into that building, into the heart of the asylum, and she hadn't come back. It had been hours. "She's probably just hiding somewhere, messing with us," Ben suggested, though his words were hollow, even to his own ears. Rachel shook her head. "No, it's not like that. This place, it changes people. It does things to them." She didn't need to explain further. They all knew exactly what she meant. Jamie turned to face the asylum once more, the towering silhouette of the crumbling building visible in the distance. His thoughts churned with growing dread. Maybe we should go back in, just to look. Maybe she... "No," Rachel interrupted firmly. "We're done here. Whatever's in there, it's not worth it." But despite her words, the tension between them was thick. There was an unspoken pull to return, to find Sarah, to uncover the mystery of what had happened in that cursed place. They could feel it. As the wind rustled through the trees, the group made their way back to the main road, their pace quickening as the feeling of being pursued intensified. It was as though the asylum itself had reached out to claim them, its unseen presence following them with every step. But as they neared the edge of the road, Jamie stopped dead in his tracks. "Wait," he said, his voice shaking. The others turned. "What?" Ben asked, irritated. Jamie didn't answer right away. He was staring at something in the distance, something they hadn't noticed before. A figure standing at the very edge of the asylum, just inside the gates. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light. A person, perhaps, though their features were blurred, obscured by the shadows of the crumbling building. But then the figure stepped forward, closer, until they were standing at the threshold of the gates. It was Sarah. "Sarah?" Rachel called out, her voice trembling. She took a hesitant step forward. The figure didn't move, but there was something unnervingly wrong about her stance. She stood rigid, almost unnatural, her body swaying slightly in the breeze. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, her arms hanging limply by her sides. Her eyes, they were wide open, but there was nothing behind them. No recognition, no fear. It was just an empty gaze. "Sarah!" Jamie shouted this time, louder, more urgent. He started to run toward her, but something in the back of his mind told him to stop, to turn around and leave. But he didn't listen. As he reached her, Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air grew colder, the trees around them seeming to bend inward, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. Jamie's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to speak to her, to ask what had happened, but the words wouldn't form. Suddenly, Sarah's head snapped around, her eyes locking onto him. They were black, no pupils, just voids of endless darkness. Her lips parted into a grotesque, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide, a grin that seemed to take over her entire face. And then, in an instant, her body lurched forward, her limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet on broken strings. Her hand shot out, grabbing Jamie's wrist with an inhuman strength. "Jamie," she whispered. The voice that came from her mouth wasn't hers. It was the voice of the asylum, of the pact. "You should have left, while you still could." Before he could react, a wave of darkness washed over him, swallowing him whole, pulling him into the depths of the abyss. His scream was cut off by the overwhelming pressure, the feeling of being crushed by the weight of the shadows. His vision blurred, and then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything went black. Back at the edge of the road, Ben and Rachel stood frozen, watching in horror as Jamie disappeared into the darkness. There was no trace of him left, no sign of struggle, no sound. It was as though the ground had swallowed him whole. "Jamie!" Ben screamed, rushing forward. But it was no use. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear. Rachel's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed onto the road, her breathing coming in sharp gasps. "We have to go. We have to get out of here," she cried, tears streaming down her face. But Ben couldn't move. He was frozen in place, staring at the spot where Jamie had vanished, his mind racing. No, he was right there. He couldn't have. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder. The sound of hundreds, maybe thousands, of voices echoing through the trees. "We're all here. We never left." Ben's eyes widened. He turned to Rachel, his breath coming out in shallow gasps. What's happening?" And then, from the darkened entrance of the asylum, they heard it. A soft, distant cry. Jamie's voice, or at least something that sounded like him. It echoed through the air, but it wasn't him. It wasn't Jamie anymore. It was the asylum calling them, pulling them in. Before Rachel could react, Ben grabbed her by the arm, yanking her toward the road. "We have to go. Now." But the shadows around them seemed to close in, the trees thickening, the road narrowing. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And as the first tendrils of darkness reached out to engulf them, they realized, with sickening certainty, that they too would never leave. The asylum had claimed them, just as it had claimed Jamie. They were part of its curse now, part of the forgotten, and they, like Sarah and Jamie, would remain trapped forever, lost in the endless, suffocating darkness of the asylum. Forever. As the darkness closed in around them, the whispers intensified, becoming an oppressive, maddening chorus that seemed to reverberate through their bones. It was everywhere. The trees, the air, the very ground beneath their feet. Everything seemed to pulse with the presence of the asylum. Ben could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his breath shallow and erratic. He tried to pull Rachel forward, but it was like the very air had thickened, become solid, dragging them down, as if the world itself was conspiring to keep them trapped here. The trees bent inward, their branches twisting like reaching fingers, closing off their escape. "We can't outrun it," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide with fear, fixed on the shadows that loomed ahead. "We're not meant to leave." Ben didn't want to believe it, but the pull of the asylum was undeniable. It was suffocating. The weight of it was pressing in from all sides, closing around them like a tightening noose. He wanted to scream, to fight, but there was nowhere to go. The road they had walked only minutes ago had disappeared, swallowed by the dark forest, the asylum's grip tightening around them. A sudden cold gust of wind swept through the trees, and in that chilling breeze, they heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the shadows. The figure of a man, cloaked in tattered black, emerged from the darkened corner of the asylum. His face was hidden behind a veil, his movements unnaturally smooth, as if he were gliding across the ground rather than walking. He stopped a few feet away from them, his gaze hidden, but they could feel the weight of his presence. Rachel stepped back, her voice a whisper. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, as if considering them. Then, slowly, he raised a hand, pointing directly at them with a gesture that felt like an inescapable command. "You should have left," he said, his voice hollow, echoing from behind the veil. "Now you are one of us." The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the shadows surged forward, swallowing the path ahead, pulling them closer to the asylum. Ben reached for Rachel's hand, but the world around them had begun to unravel. The forest seemed to warp, the trees distorting into grotesque shapes, their branches twisting like gnarled hands reaching for them. And then, just as the figure stepped forward, Rachel screamed. It was a sound of pure terror, raw and unrestrained, as she was yanked from Ben's grasp. He watched helplessly as she was pulled into the dark mass of shadows, her form fading from view as the night devoured her. "Rachel!" Ben shouted, reaching out, but it was too late. She was gone, swallowed by the endless dark. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground. His vision blurred, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. They filled his mind, suffocating him, drowning him in their endless noise. He felt as if he were being pulled into a deep, dark abyss, a place where the light never touched, where the very essence of time and space no longer existed. The figure stepped closer, bending down, his veil shifting as if it were alive. "You are part of the forgotten now, just like all the others." Ben tried to scream, to fight, but it was useless. The shadows consumed him, wrapping around his body, tightening, until he could no longer feel anything. No pain, no fear. Just the endless pull of the asylum, the suffocating presence that was now a part of him. And then there was nothing. In the town, life continued as it always had, quiet and unaware of the horrors just beyond its borders. But the asylum remained, standing tall and silent in the distance, its gates never fully closed, always waiting for the next curious soul, the next wanderer who would be drawn to its dark secrets. The whispers never stopped. They drifted through the trees, across the land, and into the town, where no one ever heard them, where no one ever questioned the silence that surrounded the old building. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might hear the faint echo of footsteps, of whispers calling out to you, beckoning you to come closer, to join the forgotten. Once you hear them, once you feel their pull, it's already too late. The asylum always gets what it wants, and those who enter never leave, forever lost, forever forgotten. As the night pressed on, the silence that followed the disappearance of Ben and Rachel was suffocating. The forest outside the asylum was still, as if holding its breath, the darkness heavy with the weight of secrets long buried. And inside the asylum, the long-forgotten halls echoed with the sounds of footsteps, slow, deliberate, eternal. In the heart of the building, in the very depths of its crumbling walls, the whispers never ceased. They drifted through the air like smoke, winding their way through the broken corridors, slipping into the cracks of the decaying asylum. The lost souls, the forsaken ones, walked its halls, forever trapped by the pact made long ago. The asylum, its walls thick with the weight of the past, had claimed its final victims, Ben, Rachel, Jamie, and Sarah. They had become one with its darkness, their souls bound to its endless hunger. There was no escape for them, no way out. The asylum had swallowed them whole, and now they were part of its curse. They were no longer remembered by the world beyond, no longer seen by the living. But they were there forever, a part of the shadows that moved within its walls. And the asylum waited. It always waited, for there would be others, curious, brave, foolish enough to venture inside. And when they did, the asylum would be ready, its hunger never satisfied, its whispers never silenced. So, if you ever find yourself standing at the gates of an old, forgotten asylum in the dead of night. You may hear the whispers calling to you, inviting you in. But remember this, once you enter, you will never leave. And the asylum will claim you, just like all the others. Forever lost, forever forgotten. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.